A report by an American security firm says that a secret Chinese military unit is behind hacking attacks against companies across the world, including American heavyweight news organizations such as the New York Times. Here now to tell us if this cyber espionage is a prelude to something even more dangerous, Gordon Chang. He's the contributor at Forbes.com, who is a regular visitor to these parts, we're happy to say, and we're glad to have you back once again, Gordon.
Thank you.
Okay, this firm is called Mandiant, this U.S. security firm, and they've released a report tracking numerous cyber attacks originating from this Chinese military unit near Shanghai. What are the Chinese alleged to have stolen?
What didn't they steal? Well, in this particular case, Chinese hackers went into the website and into the internal networks of the New York Times. They were looking for information about who were the sources for the story about the personal wealth of the family of Premier, or then Premier, Wen Jiabao.
Just go into a bit of detail on that, because the New York Times did publish this huge expose, which really rocked the Chinese, didn't it?
Yeah, last October, the story talked about the wealth of the family was something like $2.7 billion US. This followed a Bloomberg story about the wealth of the family of Xi Jinping, who is now the supreme leader of China, General Secretary of the Communist Party and president of the country. And these two stories unnerved the Chinese leadership. And so they wanted to find out who talked to Bloomberg, who talked to the New York Times. And that's why you have these Chinese military hackers going after the free press in the U.S.
Did they find what they were looking for?
We don't really know. Mandiant and the New York Times have come out with statements saying that not much was taken. Clearly, those are just sort of the pro forma statements that every organization will issue. I think essentially what the New York Times did was it confined its reporting to assets that were publicly reported. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Chinese didn't find anything useful. But really, the story is not what the Chinese took from the New York Times in this particular case, but what they're doing in terms of going after the institutions of a free society. And it's not just the newspapers, it's non-governmental organizations, charities, advocacy groups. You know, a lot of people say, well, they're going after the Pentagon. And governments, of course, spy on each other. But the Chinese have gone well beyond going after our national security establishment.
Is this a first, as far as you know?
In terms of going after
media? Big
They've
press?
been doing this in the past. And it's, of course, after the New York Times disclosure, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal talked about their sites being hacked. But this has been going on for quite some time.
Is the presumption underneath these attacks, we don't like these stories and we're going to make your life hell if you keep writing them?
Yes, and also I think that China has gone after so many websites and internal networks in the United States and around the world, so that really this was not a big deal in terms of the way the Chinese viewed it. This was just another instance of trying to find out information. But what it did, though, is it crystallized thinking in the United States and perhaps elsewhere. When people started to think about what the Chinese were doing, they were not just going after for instance, Boeing, and they wanted to find out, the most recent space plane or something like that. This was something which really went to the core of a free society.
Has there been any evidence that you know of, Gordon, that has come out of those big media companies to suggest that they were, in fact, chilled by this attempt?
That we don't know, and of course they're never going to say. When you talk to people, though, in New York and elsewhere, they are concerned about their reporting and how it affects the way that reporters are treated in China, and so of course it has to have some effect. So it has been, a concerted campaign. The Chinese don't do it because it's ineffective. And so clearly it must benefit them in some way, because this is not just an isolated incident. This has gone on for many, many years.
And are you absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, convinced that, I don't want to say the highest levels of the Chinese government or military, but pretty high up there, are behind this?
Well, they have to be. Because you think about the Great Firewall of China, nobody can have a concerted campaign of cyber intrusions into another country, thereby using a lot of computing power, and the Chinese government not knowing about it. I mean, if the government in China wants to, they will know whether a dissident touches the C key or the V key on a computer. So, of course, they know about a concerted campaign against the New York Times. That's why they'd call it the Great Firewall.
Well, I guess the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal got a lot of the play on this, but we should not forget that there were other Fortune 500 companies that also got hacked. Can you tell us about that?
Well, what China is doing is it's going after corporate America and companies around the world because they want information that will help domestic enterprises. And this really sets apart China's cyber attacks, cyber espionage campaigns, because they're going after not just the national security establishment, but also these companies. And this certainly has helped Chinese enterprises if they know, for instance, what a negotiating position of a company is going to be, or technology. A lot of technology has indeed been stolen. So this has been broad-based. As they say, if a company doesn't believe that it has been hacked, well, it's wrong, because they've gone after almost everybody who has had a contact with China.
I've seen in some of the coverage they describe this as an attempt to intimidate. I've heard it described as espionage. I've heard it described as warfare. What do you think the best way is to characterize all of this?
Well, it's a broad-based campaign, and it's against, starting from the top. When you look at the White House emails, you look at the Pentagon emails, go to the defense contractors, the companies, as we just talked about, the NGOs, the newspapers, the charities, the advocacy groups. The question is, well, who haven't they gone after? And if you're not on their list, you would feel to be sort of
left out,
snubbed.
You want to be on this list because then you're important.
That's absolutely.
That's the idea. Do you think, though, that these hacks are a prelude to something more serious?
I don't know how they could be more broad-based, but I think what they tell us, though, is that China is not a partner, it's not a friend, that it is at least an adversary, and that they do intend to harm the institutions in other countries. And so I think that it puts China in a particularly bad light. So when you look at it, it, I think, gives a context for other events that we see in the world.
Having said that, do we need to put this into perspective? Everyone who can do this does this.
No,
right?
I don't think so. No, of course.
Well, the Americans do it, the Israelis do it, the Russians do it.
Well, there are some countries that go after the corporates of other countries. People have mentioned France, Israel, maybe Russia. But China's a broad-based campaign. The United States doesn't do it. I mean, we don't go after Chinese NGOs or Chinese publications. So it is really, they've crossed a line which is significant. Because when you think about what they're doing in terms of trying to affect discourse in other countries, that is serious, because that goes to the core of a democracy, for instance.
So the nature of China's cyber espionage, you believe, is different from that of other countries?
It's certainly much more broad-based, and certainly been going on a very long time.
If the Chinese are sophisticated enough to do this, why have they not been sophisticated enough to cover it up better?
Well, perhaps, their techniques are not as good. I mean, and when you think about this, because you're on the internet, you can always be able to track it down if you spend enough time, if you have enough resources. And that's basically what we've been able to do, is to trace this back server by server across the world. And as I said, once you get across the Great Firewall, you know that there's Chinese government involvement, because nobody can maintain operations of those size and not be part of the government. I mean, the government has to know it. The government is either behind it or is complicit. So I think the Great Firewall really does separate what we know about China. It's just not some guys in their pajamas attacking, the Washington Post. It's got to be government mandated.
No, I hear you, and admittedly, I'm fishing here a little bit, but it's almost as if they wanted to be caught. It's almost as if they said, we want you to know that we are capable of doing this, so watch out. Yes?
Possible. It's just possible that they're not as good as you said, as you suggested, that they're not as good as they would like to be. But in any case, the real point is that they're doing it. Whatever, whether they're really good at it or really bad at it, they are doing it. And it shows us their intentions.
Okay. In which case, how would you characterize the U.S. government's response to all of this?
Well, the U.S. government has really tried to talk to the Chinese. President Obama, then Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, lower-tier administration officials had a number of conversations with their Chinese counterparts about the cyber attacking campaign. But the attacks against the U.S. spiked dramatically in the middle of last year, so we know that the dialogue isn't working. And that means we need different tactics than what we've been doing in the past, because obviously, we have not been able to deter the Chinese from a very sort of irresponsible course of action.
Got any suggestions?
Well, I think what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't cyber attack them to try to ward them off, because we do not want to disclose our abilities. Those abilities we will want to use only when we really have to, which is really dire situations. And I know people talk about treaties, international treaties with the Chinese. Well, the Chinese signed dozens of treaties, agreements, covenants, accords, but they dishonor all of them. So I think what we really have to do is have some very tough conversations with the Chinese that go along sort of like this line, and that is, if you don't stop this, we are going to use our economic leverage against you. Got to remember that last year, China's merchandise trade surplus against the U.S. was $315.1 billion, a record. That was 136.3% of China's overall trade surplus. That gives the United States enormous leverage. And so a conversation could be very short, but I think it could be quite effective. But we have to change our tactics, because the idea of trying to establish a cooperative dialogue with the Chinese, well, we've been doing that for years, and it has been completely ineffective. So we got to try something different.
Well, on the other hand, we owe them how much money? $2 trillion?
But I don't think that that gives them very much leverage. So, for instance, from July 2011 to December of last year, China's official holdings of U.S. Treasury obligations declined by more than $100 billion. And the United States government has been able to fund itself. Our problem is not that there are too few people who want to lend money to the U.S. Our problem is that there are too many. You know, when the Chinese talk about the nuclear option, which is using Treasury obligations to hurt us, and they've been talking about this for 5 years, they never do it because they know it wouldn't work. The global markets just are too deep, too strong to really permit the Chinese to affect us by any sort of tactics using their treasuries.
Well, it's an odd situation because I guess the United States in particular and the West in general are massively indebted to them, and things are working well for them in that regard. So how much saber rattling can we really do to get them to change their behavior here? It doesn't sound like there doesn't sound like there are many good options on the table.
We have a lot of good options because, for instance, the United States does not need the Chinese economy, but China needs the United States. We can buy our shoes and our toys from other countries.
But we
and
don't.
In fact, we're starting to, because low-end manufacturing is leaving China. The Chinese economy right now is quite fragile. Their recovery is quite anemic. It's not the 7.8% growth that they claimed for last year. It could be 4 or 5%. And clearly, we have seen Chinese growth rates decline over the last 2 years. This is a really important problem for them. And so it gives the United States the ability to be able to say, if you want our market, which you can't replace, then you have got to stop the cyber attacks. You have got to stop helping North Korea. You have got to stop helping Iran. There are so many conversations that we can have with the Chinese, but we don't.
I'm trying to think, though, where was the last situation where the United States, if you like, hectored or lectured the Chinese, and the result of that was some change in policy that the Americans liked? I don't know that that works, does it?
Right, and that's because our tactics have been ineffective. You know, we have tried to integrate the Chinese into the international system, and therefore we have ignored grossly irresponsible conduct, and we've created these perverse incentives. As the Chinese behavior has been unacceptable, we've accepted it. And so that has taught the Chinese that they can continue on. And so, you know, what we see in the world you start from talking from North Korea, cyber attacks, predatory trade behavior, all of these things, you name it, China is going in the wrong directions, especially in the last 2 years.
You're not suggesting we should go to war over this, right?
Of course not.
Okay, so something short of war, but more than just a little tough talk. What are the range of options in the middle there?
Well, the range of options really involve the economy, because they do need the American market right now. And they need it more than they have in the past. So it could be very simple. You know, President Obama getting on the phone with Xi Jinping and saying, by the way, we're going to start inspecting goods that come in at Long Beach. And the line of ships are going to be halfway across the Pacific trying to get into California. Now, would you like to talk about some of the things that you've been doing, like cyber attacks? I think it would be particularly effective because the Chinese understand that. They're ruthlessly pragmatic. They would understand talk like that.
I wonder, though, whether you'd have Xi Jinping on the phone saying, please stop doing that, but you might have the president of Walmart on the phone as well, saying, I can't get my product to my customers.
You know, obviously there are going to be some downsides, but we cannot allow the Chinese to continue to do what they've been doing. Otherwise, they will take even more technology. The estimates of the loss of technology from the United States are astounding. You know, we just can't continue that. There's got to be a new arrangement with the Chinese. And of course, everything's going to have a downside, but we have backed ourselves into a corner for so long maintaining ineffective policies with regard to the Chinese. And as I said, they have been going in the wrong direction. So obviously, we need to do something new. If we don't, we know that we're not going to be able to push them in better directions.
Gordon, let's play out that phone call a little further. What if President Obama picks up the phone, calls his counterpart in China, says what you just said, and then the Chinese premier says, yeah, but, Mr. President, we deny the allegations, and I want to point out to you that we, too, in China, are victims of cyber attacks as well, maybe not from the United States Pentagon, but from places in points that we don't know. I have a feeling, Mr. President, you're playing politics with all of this. What happens if he gets that response?
And President Obama would say, I'm really surprised you would say that. And cyber attacks from the United States? Of course not.
And would he be lying if he said that?
Of course he would be lying, because the Pentagon does, of course, ensure Chinese networks. But we do not go after their corporates. We do not go after their publications. We do not go after the few non-governmental organizations there. We don't harass Chinese officials. That's the real difference.
Okay, we look for codes when high-ranking U.S. officials speak, and I wonder if we got one this past week when the National Security Advisor Thomas Donnellan said that the Chinese hacking had become, quote, a key point of concern, raising the issue of whether or not this, I mean, there's a whole host of irritants, right, between China and the United States. Has this suddenly moved to the top of the list?
Well, in the middle of March, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, elevated cyber attacks as the #1 national security threat, well above now terrorists. And although, we think about this, China is the #1 cyber criminal. So essentially what Washington has said is that China's become America's #1 security threat. It didn't say that in those words, but that's the clear implications of what Director Clapper was talking about. That's not exactly code.
We're going to talk to Zbigniew Brzezinski in just a few minutes, the former National Security Director for Jimmy Carter, National Security Advisor, who will tell us about his concerns about this, and will tell us that we need a kind of a we have a Geneva Conventions for war, armed war. We need a Geneva Conventions of sorts for cyber war. And I wonder if you think there's any value in doing that, given that you just told us earlier that the Chinese sign treaties and then violate them anyway.
Yeah, I don't see any real value in that. That just sort of postpones the process. And, we look at their compliance record on the World Trade Organization, look at their compliance record even on a more serious issue, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Look at human rights covenants. You go start from the top to the bottom. This is not something that's going to be solved by treaties. This is what the world tried to do in the 1920s. With all of these pacts to outlaw war, to limit the number of battleships, all the rest of it, even the covenant that established the League of Nations, it just didn't work. And that's unfortunate. Sometimes you have to deal with belligerent powers in different ways, and they do not involve signing treaties that the other side is going to ignore.
But let me follow up on that other angle that I brought up a moment ago, which is if America pursues this and singles out China for this kind of behavior, do they run the risk of ticking off corporate America, which so depends on cheap goods from China for their bottom line?
Sure, it will irritate corporate America, but sometimes the national security interests of the United States will trump the interests of Caterpillar or Walmart. That's unfortunate, but sometimes we get ourselves into those situations, and this is one of them, because we just cannot continue the way that we have with China's activities, as extensive and as pervasive as they are.
Play it out. What happens if America is unable to make any progress on this? What happens?
I think relations with Beijing are going to deteriorate. They will deteriorate in any event, given China's positions on a whole number of issues right now that put it into opposition to the international community and specifically to the United States. We have North Korea, which is playing on at this very moment. We have the Chinese trying to take islands away from the Japanese, and we have a mutual security treaty with Japan. We have China helping the Iranian nuclear weapons program. We can stay here for hours talking about the things where China's doing things that trouble us. And so these are going to be, cyber attacking is just one of these major issues. But clearly it comes at a very bad time for China, because Americans are starting to look at China in a new light. The conversations in Washington and even New York are becoming different. And we're becoming more realistic. We have a long way to go in terms of the way we view these things, but nonetheless, I think this attack on the New York Times really did change people's views of things, because they said, why are they doing this? And I think that that's important for us to do, is to start to look at China in a new light.
With just a couple of minutes to go here, North Korea has been in the news a lot lately for obvious reasons. And let me just ask you a two-part question here. Number one, do you know whether North Korea is doing any of this cyber attacking as well? Are they capable of that?
Well, they are, and there have been cyber attacks on South Korea 2 weeks ago, and there were extensive cyber attacks on the South Koreans about 6 or 7 months ago. So the North Koreans are pretty good at this themselves.
And staying with this part of the world, how worried are you by all of what's transpired over the last couple of weeks between the two Koreas?
I'm worried because Kim Jong-un, the ruler of North Korea, has been in power for less than 16 months, hasn't consolidated his position. The regime is in disarray. At no time since 1949 has a North Korean leader had a smaller base of support. I'm afraid that he could try to do anything because he'll be desperate. And the region around him has gotten very volatile. The South Koreans, the Chinese, the South Koreans don't want to absorb any more blows from North Korea without responding. And the Chinese military, becoming much more powerful, has traditionally supported Pyongyang. So none of this is going in the right direction.
As always, Gordon, even when you bring bad news, we appreciate your visits here to TVO. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Gordon Chang, Forbes.com.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.